Okay, in this video we'll learn how to use these transform tools here in Unity. We'll also learn why the hierarchy is important, and this is the hierarchy here on this side, this left area. We'll also learn what something called prefabs are and why they're important in Unity. So if I click on my knight, right here, if I look on the inspector, which is this right area, you have a few of these different regions that you can close off, right? These are called components. And you'll learn what different components do later on, but the one we're looking at right now is something called the transform component. And the transform consists of three different properties of each object, one called the position, one called the rotation, and one called the scale. Now the scale will also have, each of these properties also have an X, Y, and a Z component, right? So we'll learn how they're stored later. It's stored in something called vector3, but for now, just know that there's a position, a rotation, and a scale. To play around with the position, rotation, and scale, we can use these tools up here on the left. So the first one here is called the move tool, and when I click on it, we have a couple of arrows show up. So if I click on this red arrow and move it, if you look at this X position here as I'm moving it, right, it's changing that from the center of the screen to left of the screen to right of the screen. Right, so I can come in here and just choose a value I want to start at 2, for example, and then the same goes here for this Y position. So this will force the sprite to only change the Y value. Right, if I wanted to change both the X and Y position on the screen, I can click on this middle rectangle and I can drag that around. And I can put my knight wherever I want. Now, next we have the rotate tool. So if I click on that, same as before, I can choose an axis to rotate in. Or that way. That looks kind of weird. Right. So your X rotation should be 0 by default, and Y should be 0 by default, and actually even Z should be 0 by default. Cool. So there's your rotation, and then scale is to do with the size. So if I click on this and scale up in X, I'll make it larger in the X position. I'll undo that. By default, your scale should pretty much be 1. So that should be 1, this should be 1, this should be 1. Okay, so that's the original size of the image. If I wanted to scale the length and width to keep the ratio of the length and width, I'll click on this middle box and I can scale up like that to increase the size. Now I can zoom around the screen with Control and then my mouse wheel. So there's my screen. Notice how I have the camera object. We won't touch that for now. And here I have a white rectangle. That's essentially going to be the game area. So we're going to cover all that up. Okay, so next, how this hierarchy works. To do that, I'm actually going to drag out some of those platforms we downloaded in the last game. Okay, so here I have my grounds, and they've already been split as well. I'm going to choose, I don't know, say I want one of them. And say next to it, I want one of these. And next to that, I want one of this to create that type of platform. Right, so if I'm just going to zoom in so we can see. And then I'm going to click there and drag that just so it's touching. Okay. Okay, so notice I can do this. I can set them all equal by giving it all the same Y value. So I'm just going to make it -2.5 on its position property. And then same here. And same here. This won't always work. Oh, there you go. Prime example of it not working. depending on where the center of the image is placed, we'll start learning about pivots soon when we get to animations. But say I set that up, this ugly looking platform, but whatever. Okay, so I've set that up. I'm just going to zoom out again. Now notice when I dragged them in, it created, you know, a ground 9, a ground 11, and a ground 12 up here. Okay, now what I can do, what if I wanted to move all these 3 platforms, right? I can select them all, and then I can just move it like that, sure. But instead of having to select them all, remember here I only have a few objects in the hierarchy. If I did that like that, I'd have, you know, I could potentially have thousands per level, depending on how many sprites I'm using. So I'm going to right click in here and create a empty object, 2D object. Oh, sorry, just an empty object. I'm just going to rename it to, I don't know, platform trio, like that. And then I'm going to drag all these and drag them into the platform trio. Now, if I want to move them around, I can just click on that platform trio and move them left and right, like that. And I can also do the same with scaling, etc. So if I wanted to scale them, stretch them, whatever, you know, it works just by clicking on this platform trio structure. Now, what I can also do is grab this platform trio, and I'm going to go here to assets now, and I'm going to open prefabs. And to understand the full potential of prefabs, that's something you kind of learn over time. You can't just learn off one video. So as we're creating the game, you'll come to understand it a bit more. But essentially, if I have say I click on my knight, right? And I'm going to add a component to him. I'm just going to call it box collider 2D. Right. If I drag him in now to my prefab, right, he'll get stored as the sprite, but also as all the settings that he currently has. So if I want to create a new knight now, instead of having to create another knight and give it another box collider 2D, I can just drag out a knight here and he will by default have that box collider 2D. Now that seems kind of simple for now, but we're going to be adding, you know, scripts, animations, components to our characters. So easy to just create a prefab once from the start, and then later on you can modify that as you go. And then you can just keep dragging it out whenever you need it. So for example, this platform trio, I'm going to click and drag that in, and I save that whole platform trio. So if I zoom out, I can now drag this platform trio in and I'll have all 3, right? And then I can just keep doing that. There you go. So I have my platforms. Oops. I have my platforms all kind of set up. Cool. So there's my knight, there's my platforms. We've touched on what a prefab is. We've touched on how to use this hierarchy, and we've also touched on how these transform tools work.